Okay, I want to talk today about politics in relation to African Americans, especially activism, things that you see, and I guess on blogs and on YouTube's, so video blogs, uh, and I guess even my own personal development on this issue because it's not a finished thing. I don't have any answers. I just doing basically thought experiments when thinking about these issues. The issues are extremely complex and how they interact with the individual and the population as a whole. And it's just, I think, at this point, really, there's really a non-existent voice when it comes to African American activism, as I see it. It seems very scattershot. It's not any type of strong organizations in place to have a national voice. I think the closest thing you have right now is Black Lives Matter, and that seems more of a movement. Although I think there are some organizations that operate underneath that banner, but they don't own that title. I mean, that's a movement that extends beyond any individual organization, kind of like the civil rights movement. No one, there were important organizations that acted within civil rights, but there was no one organization that owned the entire thing. I think Black Lives Matter is kind of like that. But I think the extreme limitations are, in some ways, it's just a part of the reality that we're more included within America. We're not excluded like we were at one point, legally excluded. I mean, so, we have an African American president, at least we had for the next few days until officially Donald Trump takes office. But we've had that for the last 8 years, and there are African American politicians all across the country, African Americans involved in business, even in organizations that do not have an African American majority. That's in politics and in business. You have organizations that African Americans rose up to that they're just a portion of the workers or the customers, and then you have African Americans taking office in places where they are nowhere near the majority. So there's a lot of different stories in this, and I think because there is more inclusion now, that's taken away the need for uh, activism, or activism hasn't adapted. What activism that you see, and I think because there's this void, a lot of small voices have been able to kind of fit into that void. They're not able to fill it completely, but they're able to add their voices to that missing space. So you see a lot of voices of people who, in my opinion, are talking antiquated language. They haven't. I mean, it's 2017 now, and they are still looking back to past movements as their blueprint, like Marcus Garvey. That's 100 years ago, and they're not just looking at this from a historian. Knowing your history is very important, but they are not looking at these things and as just like historic movements that we should know about or never forget. They're looking at it as like a blueprint for what we should be doing now, and they look at these things as high points in our political history, which is kind of strange for me because you look at the things that happened during that time period or were happening during that time period when we were completely excluded from national life. The challenges were just so much more greater than they were at today. Um, so it just seems like the value you would get from those movements today are just it's not as great as the what value they got back then, and it can be even argued that the value back then wasn't as great as it should have been. So these are just some of the things that it just seems like this antiquated attachment to these past movements instead of creating something new that is relevant for people today. Um, and it seems like the most thing that's most relevant is to have greater inclusion. There are issues that we're dealing with, like the criminal justice system. And even if we have a greater, if issues with the criminal justice system affect us greater than it affects other groups, which is a strong possibility, But it's probably a bad idea to like minimize the pain that other people have suffered, and there are probably other people that are suffering more than we are on a per person basis. Uh, but it seems like a better idea because you're going to reform things on that stage. You need cooperation from groups outside of your, from people outside your normal group. And they're always going to be fellow travelers, but you also need the participation of people who are not fellow travelers, people who normally do not have an interest, or your interests don't normally line up, but they decide to fight with you or at least join you in this momentary battle because it makes sense for them. I think you always have to find a way that whatever you're doing politically, if you have an opponent and you want them to bring, you want that opponent to come to your side, you have to decide how can we discuss these issues in ways that it makes sense to you. You know, it's not just my own personal self-interest. It's in everyone's self-interest for get these things done. So you know, you have things like criminal justice reform, you have healthcare. The interests in those things are extend far beyond African Americans. So you got to start thinking like, okay, moving forward in movements, what should be the focus? Should be focus on individual racial groups, or should be a focus beyond um, the individual segments of the population and look at the universal? And I think that's the only thing that makes sense because when you look at a lot of the movements that were so successful is because they were universal. You know, civil rights. As much as I love Malcolm X, when he was a member of the Nation of Islam, he fought very strongly against the idea of civil rights for African Americans because they were for separation, for segregation. One of the most troubling things is that I have a book on, it's a wonderful book. Well, it's not just mine, it's the family's. And it has great, Malcolm X, the great pictures. You might be able to get it online. And it shows photographies from the 60s of Malcolm X. And one of the things that they show in there is a meeting that occurred in one of the Nation of Islam mosques. And they invited to sit in representatives from the American Nazi Party. Because although they're in some way opposition because they were a black separatist organization, but because they were separatists, they had shared goals with those people. So they actually invited them in some kind of weird game where they were trying to say, okay, this is, if we come to power, this is how we're going to split America between the two groups. Two powerless groups trying to decide how they're going to split America. But I mean, and then you also see Marcus Garvey's organization, how he also reached out to the Klan because he was also for separation and sending in the Back to Africa movement. So you see, there are things you can criticize about these movements. I know people look for things that they can latch onto that were positive as far as, you know, Black African American pride or Negro pride back then. But they also dabbled in some of the things that you can really criticize that are just totally unacceptable. And, you know, opposed to Garvey with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was for greater inclusion in America in the sense, you know, the end of segregation and legal segregation. On the opposite of Nation of Islam, Malcolm X was the civil rights movement, who were fighting for African Americans' rightful inclusion within the society. What was more successful? I mean, if you look at the outcomes of these movements, they brought greater real change. And when you look at the present day African Americans who are kind of attached to that old school activism, they're still fighting those same battles. And because of so much change that's occurred since that time, they have to ignore the change. They have to say that there's things haven't changed at all. We're still slaves. I mean, you still hear people say that kind of crazy stuff. They have to reject any type of example of Black advancement as just being a phantom, smoke and mirrors. And it's just ridiculous. They kind of reinforce African American inferiority by having this attachment to this old school racial oppression that has changed. They don't recognize change, and that's a real problem. So, any forward movements has to be positive, and unfortunately, if it's going to be, if it's any movements, it's going to have to be rooted in some type of sense of justice that makes sense, not just for us, but for other people. Um, if it's going to actually be relevant and actually improve the lives of the people.